Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barrack of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. He's the dollar vigilante. He's a top technology entrepreneur out of Canada, now down in sunny Mexico, Jeff Berwick. So thanks for joining us again today, Jeff.
Oh, great to see you, Jason.
Well, you can see me. You have video on, Jeff. I see you just chilling back there in the sunshine here while it's about 30 degrees, and we just had a surprise snowstorm in the D.C. metro area. But
yeah, that whole global warming thing isn't working out very well.
Well, that's why the people in power rebranded it to climate change, so they're right, hot or cold, right? So. But let's not talk about that right now. We could probably talk about that for a while. Our listeners can go read a book called Watermelons. It goes in depth about that. I think that covers a lot of the stuff. But Jeff, let's talk about Bitcoin, because we have a lot of naysayers now coming out about Bitcoin. You know, you've had the Charlie Shrem stuff, and then you had the article on Dorian Nakamoto. It was like a tempted it piece, and it seems like every day the mainstream media just keeps rolling out negative article after negative article after negative article. I mean, the stuff on Twitter is just, it's constantly negative from all the mainstream people. So what's your opinion on this?
Well, I think there's a number of things going on. I think part of it is, well, when you listen to the media, I just watched a video actually from 1993 from the Today Show, and they were talking about the internet, and it was Bryant Gumbel, and he was like, "What is internet?" And he didn't even know how to say the @ sign, and they put up on the screen that he had to say an email address, and he said, "What is that squirrely thing?" And they went on for like a minute or two, and that's how I feel when I'm watching the mainstream media talk about Bitcoin right now. It feels very much like about the same way that the internet felt in 1993. It was a lot of confusion. People were just sort of laughing at it. Brian Gumbel on this show was saying how, what is it exactly? And someone said, well, you can actually get like mail over your computer. And he's like, well, how does that work without paper and stuff like that? It was really... that's the same way I see the Bitcoin right now. So many of the mainstream media have no clue whatsoever. There's very few that do. Bloomberg's been one of the better ones in the mainstream. Of course, Fox Business is still pretty clueless, Stuart Varney. But then you also have a lot of people who aren't in the mainstream media who are talking about it. And I think that it runs the full gamut. Most people seem very skeptical of it because they've never used it, and they think it's some sort of like a video game credit or something. Most of the people who are really negative on it really just have no clue about it, and that should be your first hint not to listen to those kind of people. There is a lot of people who know what they're talking about, including yourself and myself and many other people, and Jeffrey Tucker is another good one. And I would go and read and listen to some of those people if you're interested, and you should be interested because this is going to be a revolution in money and banking, and it's not going away anytime soon, no matter what you hear on the media or from your ignorant friends.
Yeah, now I think, Bitcoin is very speculative if you're buying the currency, but obviously, like, in a new industry, you're building a new industry, so there's going to be enormous growing pains. There's going to be trouble, there's going to be bankruptcies, there's going to be screw-ups of companies because, the industry is growing so fast and changing so rapidly that there's going to be a lot of failures of these over 100-plus digital currencies. There's going to be a lot of those ones that go bust. There's going to probably be other Bitcoin exchanges that go bust besides Mt. Gox, although there were people, we've had you on and Trace Meyer on in the past, and you were warning us not to put any money into Mt. Gox for at least like 6 or 8 months prior to Mt. Gox's bankruptcy. Yeah,
what we're seeing really is an evolution in the free market. The internet is a fairly free place still. It's actually one of the most free places on earth. And this is what happens in free markets when you have innovation. It's wild and it's dynamic and it's volatile. And this scares people because they really like it when there's governments involved and they steal everyone's money and then give some of it back whenever something bad happens. And they want you to protect them. So a lot of people said about Mt. Gox, oh, that's terrible, we need to regulate it. So then someone could bail out Mt. Gox. And no, that's not what you should be doing because it's actually good Mt. Gox failed. And we warned about that before. We said it wasn't a very trustworthy exchange, and they're really very basic. They were one of the first Bitcoin exchanges in the world, and it actually used to be a place where they traded video game credits. And so they definitely didn't have their technology up to speed to protect against a lot of things, and it's fine if a thing like Mt. Gox goes down. Of course, if you lost money on it, that's terrible. I'm sorry if that happened to you, but this is what happens in private free enterprise. Is things fail all the time, and it's good because rather than propping up something like Mt. Gox, which was a real disaster, let it go away, and let other people come into the market and take over, people with better innovations and better technology.
Yeah, I mean, 6 to 8 months ago, even then, I was getting warnings, like I said, from yourself and Trace Meyer about, it's taking too long to convert my bank account money into a Mt. Gox account. It's tough if I buy Bitcoins from Mt. Gox and move it to another virtual wallet. It's taking way too long than normal. So the signs were there a long time ago that they were not running their business, efficiently as a good private sector enterprise. And in a free market, like you said, these companies are going to get punished. And most people are not used to free market forces. Most people, their whole life have been used to this kind of pseudo-fascist model where we just have enormous amounts of regulations in each sector, except for the internet. And the internet's one of the few sectors in most of our lives where we've had kind of real free market forces for the most part, and some people just have humongous amounts of uncertainty and cognitive dissonance. They just can't deal with the stuff that's gone on the internet. The majority of people, I think the majority of Americans who claim to be, amazing at business, they couldn't work at an internet company because of all the rapidly changing stuff like that and how their payroll could fluctuate and they could get fired the next day or find a new job. It's a different type of mindset, and I don't think, unfortunately, it's something that's been conditioned for Americans to where, they've learned this in their business schools to where they want the opportunity to make unlimited income and things like that.
Yeah, there's just so much conditioning, and it's sort of sad that Americans, of all people, are the people that we're having to try to help condition to working in a free market in private enterprise because they're so not used to it, because the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, has been such a big part of anything to do in the U.S. now for 100 years, and it's just getting worse and worse, and everything's regulated and all that kind of a thing. And so people are just not used to it. But they better get used to it, because these things are going away. Governments are anachronistic. Central banks are definitely anachronistic. And things like Bitcoin are actually moving to a new technology all on their own. And the government actually can't even stop it, neither can the central banks. They can try to stop it, and they are trying in many different cases. And that's actually one of the biggest risks of Bitcoin is government, of course. And that's actually usually the biggest risk. They always try to stop innovation, just like you see with Tesla in, I think, 3 or 4 states in the U.S. now. Tesla,
New Jersey,
New Jersey just banned it because, well, we have to.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's totally ridiculous. But it's amazing how many people support these things. They're like, well, we have to protect the automobile industry, or these new innovations will, GM and Ford will go away. It's like, well, good. If they're not innovating, let them go away and let better things come to the market. It's not like it's going to destroy everything. People who worked at GM, if they're good enough, will go work at Tesla. This is a natural innovation. The same as trying to outlaw the horse and buggy when the Ford car came out. That's the exact same sort of thing they're trying to do, and this is what governments always try to do. The governments always try to keep us locked in the present or even in the past, and they never want anything to change. And then, of course, all the great things that come in life, or almost all of them, come from change and innovation, and that's what the government is always trying to fight.
It's a great analogy with the horse and buggy whip compared to the electric car. And if Tesla can make a profit without really any subsidy, selling those $90,000 Tesla Roadsters or $60,000 Tesla Model S's, right? And GM cannot make a profit selling their Chevy Volt, which, looks like a clunky car. It doesn't have all the bells. And Tesla hired, an Apple engineer, and they made it like a rocket ship inside. And, every tech entrepreneur has one in their driveway, supposedly in San Francisco, all the big shots. That they don't deserve to get a bailout. But they have, so much pull. They've been making so much money and investing in and lobbying for so long. I actually know the GM lobbyist here in the D.C. area. I don't. But anyway, though, she makes a lot of money. But it's a very powerful lobby here, and that's not even the United Auto Workers. So you have the United Auto Workers and the GM corporate lobby and all these other guys, getting subsidies and all this other stuff. It's just, a dying business model of let's protect this industry, let's protect that old industry, and, that's not what's going to create the jobs. Because if we had free markets, we would have the jobs being created as fast as the old ones died, or maybe even faster.
Oh, absolutely. And, people get really confused, and they say, oh, I'm not sure if I like government, or I'm not sure if I like unions. The only thing you have to keep in mind is who's using force, who's using violence. Tesla is not using violence or force to make people buy their cars. But these governments are actually using violence by saying we're going to ban them. And that's actual violence, because if Tesla tries to come into New Jersey and tries to sell a car, a bunch of guys with guns will come and put them in a cage, and that's violence. That's using force. So the number one thing I try to tell people when it comes to these sort of things, and if you're not too sure about what's good or what's bad, always look at who's using violence. And it's always the government. And you brought up the unions. They use the government to use violence to force employers to do certain things, when in actuality all they really need to do is just negotiate. And if they want to form a private union, which is all voluntary and everyone wants to join it, that's fine, and they can negotiate with the employer, but they can't force the employer through violence to employ any of them if the employer doesn't want to. There should always be a free exchange of goods and services. And when you have that, the innovations and the amount of economic prosperity that comes from it is massive, and that's what's really fueled the last century of technological growth. And none of that came from the government. And many people just are so used to this sort of a system now. It's really sad to see. And of course, many people in places like China, which, if you would have said that 30 or 40 years ago, that the Chinese, many Chinese people are much more entrepreneurial, much more free market than Americans, people would have just laughed, and they'd be right to laugh. But this is how the world has changed dramatically. And now we're seeing, of course, what's going on in Russia. They're all standing up to the U.S. government. There's massive changes going on in the world today, and it's almost impossible to keep up, but it's also quite exciting and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, not just unions are using the government, through lobbying and pull, as Ayn Rand would say in Atlas Shrugged, pull and looting and all this mooching and all this other stuff. You have special interest groups through whatever different types of special interest groups in every single industry who all want to maintain the status quo. They all want to keep their money coming in, their government checks coming in. You have crony capitalism, which is taught basically at all levels of the government school system, even in the major business schools. As an entrepreneur, I've been in MBA classes. I'm an MBA dropout, I probably say that. But one of the things that they're teaching us in business school is that one of your main customers should be the government, just because it's easier to get the checks from them, and the checks keep coming in once you get them. So, I mean, that stuff is taught. It's not taught to be self-sufficient and things like that. It's to find money from wherever you can, and the government's one of the easiest sources of money. And, this is the type of crony capitalist mindset we have here in the United States now, where you have companies like GE, that are worth like $300 billion market cap, but then they have all these lobbyists and special interest things, and then they don't pay any taxes.
Yeah, it's terrible. Of course, all this is caused by government. If there was no government, GE couldn't go to anyone and say, hey, use your force and make things happen for us. People would actually have to produce things for the market that the market wants, or they go out of business. And for whatever reason, this has all been lost in the U.S. over the last 100 years. This used to be just the way it was. And it was a great thing, and it created so many great things. And nowadays, so many people are clinging on to these government and no one even asks where this money comes from. When you're in this business school and they say, oh, you get the government as your customer, they've always got lots of money. It's like, well, where did that money come from? It's stolen money, or it's actually inflated money, which is actually another form of theft. And no one even brings that up. It's just unbelievable to me. And that's another good reason to never really go to school.
Well, we're all for education. So
yes.
As long as people are getting educated, if you can educate yourself on your own, if you're getting homeschooled, as long as you're learning useful things, then that's fine. So wherever you learn your useful things, if you're a computer programmer and you want to go to school, learn computer programming, or be an engineer or learn physics or things like that, I think school is somewhat useful for the science, technology, engineering, and math maybe. But, eventually, though, those are probably going to go more online and open source, too. We're starting to see that now.
Oh, yeah. MIT offers all their courses online for free. You can get all information online for free. And you brought up computer programming. I wouldn't go to college for computer programming. They're years behind the free market. They're definitely not teaching Bitcoin in computer programming class and peer-to-peer technologies and decentralization. They're teaching things that happened 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. Most of these institutions are usually far behind. Now, of course, there's always exceptions. I'm sure there's one amazing computer programming school on earth. But for the most part, if you're a computer programmer, you have a computer, you have the internet, or you want to learn computer programming, you can learn it on the internet.
Yeah, that's a good point about computer programming. The other ones, the science, technology, engineering, and math, are probably people can learn those in school. But the computer programming, I'll agree with you on that one, where it's much better online because Google and all those are offering, I think, free tutorials besides just MIT. So let's transition to the next topic here. You sell a lot of second passports to American and Canadian citizens and other foreigners at Dollar Vigilante. But I'm hearing that the U.S. government is going to these other countries where American citizens can often buy the passports and telling them, to charge more money for them and, delay them out years or things like that. Can you just talk about that from your experience since you're actually doing these deals with the passports?
Yeah, sure. We have tdvpassports.com, and we help people get foreign passports. And this is more and more necessary over time as these Western governments all start collapsing, and they're making it very hard for you to do business internationally or even to get your assets internationalized, especially Americans through things like FATCA, the Foreign Accounts something Transaction Act, compliance or something. And what they're doing is they're making it almost impossible for Americans to be able to open bank or brokerage accounts around the world. And this is going into effect. It's already been in effect for the last few years, but it's actually going officially into effect on July 1st, 2014. And it's very important for people, especially if you have assets, to consider this as a part of financial planning, is to get a second passport, because as these governments collapse, and this happens all throughout history, this just happened in Ukraine recently, that people just start taking the money away from their own citizens when they start to collapse. And the U.S. is going to collapse in the next 5 to 10 years or sooner. So it's definitely something to do. And you brought up the point that, the U.S. government is actively making it much harder for U.S. citizens to get foreign passports. They're putting in, last year or 2 years ago, they tried to pass an act called the Anti-Expatriation Act when Edward Saverin of Facebook had $1 billion capital gains coming on a Facebook IPO, and he actually expatriated to Singapore. And because of that, he didn't have to pay about $300 million in capital gains taxes. And this really infuriated the U.S. government, who considers that their money. And so they start putting all these things into place where they make it harder and harder for you to actually get out of the U.S. legally with another passport or to actually become a citizen of another country. And yes, I've seen 2 cases personally. One in the Dominican Republic. It used to take 3 years to get a passport in the Dominican Republic. And then it went to 4, then it went to 5, then 7, and now I believe it's 8 years. And so I talked to the top legal firm in the DR, and I said, what's going on here? And they said, the U.S. government's putting on a lot of pressure. They want us to make it a lot harder for people to get citizenship here. And the same thing happened down in Paraguay recently last year. The president of the country left to Europe on a business trip or a personal trip, I don't know, and the U.S. actually instituted a coup through the CIA, the usual thing. They usually take over most countries that way. And they said that the president didn't come back within 8 hours and answer these claims they had, that they were going to kick him out of office. And, of course, that was impossible. There's no plane that can get there that fast. So they instituted a coup and put in a new president, and immediately they instituted an income tax, because they never had an income tax in Paraguay before that. It used to be 0% income tax, and now they have 10%. So this is the U.S. government that is coming into all these places and trying to institute all sorts of things to make it so these countries are less, not as good of places for Americans to go. So they're either trying to make it very difficult for you to get a foreign citizenship, or they're trying to get other countries to increase their taxes so that it's less of a valuable for people to go there. And so this should really wake up a lot of Americans of what's going on. They're obviously trying to make sure you can't get out, and you can only see where this might end up going.
It's very interesting, and I was actually going to bring up and ask you about the taxes, if they're going to get the taxes increase. So it seems like a multi-layered strategy here. And then you have all these other taxes that the American politicians are trying to implement. The Democratic politicians, they want, if they ever win back the House of Representatives, they want to implement the carbon cap and trade and layer taxes onto that. They're also talking about a value-added tax as like a national sales tax on e-commerce on the internet, because they want to cut at that. We've already seen the states like California and stuff go after that, with Amazon and stuff for small e-commerce, but the federal level wants that. So it really seems to me that the U.S. is kind of implementing, like, I think Lenin was the one who talked about the policy that the best way to destroy the citizens and get them to bend to his will was to just grind the citizens through a combination of inflation and taxation.
Yeah, absolutely, and this is very typical of the end stage of a lot of governments. The U.S. government is, the most bankrupted government in the history of the earth. Now, $17 trillion in debt, going up nearly $1 trillion a year right now, and that's only in what they say that it's going up. If you actually account for it in the properly accepted accounting principles, it's nearly $100 trillion in debt now, which works out to about $250,000 per every man, woman, and child in the U.S. So a family of four has nearly $1 million of U.S. federal government debt and liabilities overhanging it, and more than 75% of Americans right now are living paycheck to paycheck. So there's no way to get that money back. It's going to default or inflate or hyperinflate the dollar to nothing. Either one's not good. And because of that, all these governments around the world are just trying to take more and more of their tax slaves' own money because they have no money of their own. So this is very typical of the end stages of these governments. Whenever a government collapses, it usually really collapses very messily. And what they usually try to do is take as much as they can before it collapses. Government is nothing but the largest criminal organization on earth, the U.S. government, and all other governments are just the largest criminal organization in their area. And it should be no surprise that what they do is just try to take as much money as possible before everything collapses. And we're actually seeing that now, especially in the financial system. We're seeing a lot of these banks and banksters, a lot of fraud going on, an incredible amount of fraud going back to the mortgage-backed securities and all that kind of stuff. They're just trying to take as much as they can before it all collapses. And now we're seeing banker suicides almost every day. So I think a few of the people in this industry are starting to see what's going on and starting to see the collapses coming, and they're deciding to get out of here before it's too late.
Yeah, I think some of the banker suicides are based on like a case that was being brought by the Justice Department here in the U.S. There was actually some whistleblowers, and the names got out, and I think some of the guys on the list are the ones that ended up having suicides or whatever. But it's not really something that I've read a lot on. But it's not surprising with the amount of fraud in the total system here. And then you have the new confiscation scheme. You have Obama announcing during his State of the Union about this My IRA plan, where it looks like, they're trying to trick people into putting more of their retirement money voluntarily, a la, one of those schemes with the Atlas Shrugged that Ayn Rand brought up, we have to get you to consent to all these things, right? So they're trying to get people to consent to you'll get a return, but these people don't have a financial education. They don't understand, nominal value versus real value, right? So if you're getting paid a nominal return while they're inflating the thing at 9 or 10% per year, and you're getting not even 1% coupon value on your bond, you're losing your principal and getting destroyed. Yeah,
it doesn't take too much, very long under compound interest, 9% per year of loss to lose everything. Of course, they won't lose. This is the thing. Inflation is incredibly dangerous for this reason. And I think it was Henry Ford or someone said that if people actually understood how it all worked, they'd revolt tomorrow. But because of it, not one in I think it was Henry Ford who also said that. Said not one in a million people understands how inflation works. So a lot of these.
Actually, it was Keynes.
Was it Keynes?
Yep.
Okay.
It was when Keynes was actually saying that day. Probably hadn't drank too much. He was a classic flip-flopper, so he could go off, on manic phases where he actually maybe was sane for a minute or two.
Well, that was a correct statement. That hardly anyone does understand it. And even today with the internet, there's still so many people who don't understand how inflation works. So with this My IRA that you brought up, if people put in, let's say they put in $10,000 and they got their treasury bonds paying at 1% a year, and the Federal Reserve is inflating the currency at about it's around 10% per year right now, so they're losing about 9% per year. If the bond was set to expire in 5 years or 10 years, let's say 10 years, they would get their $10,000 back at the end of the 10 years, and they'd be all happy. But at that point, $10,000 would buy maybe a dinner at a nice restaurant, and people just get confused. And then what they think is, this restaurant, they're taking advantage of me. They're raising their prices all the time, and it's just crazy.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's like how we've been conditioned to think here in the United States. But as more and more people wake up, as you do your Anarchast podcast and I do my podcast, I think that's going to slowly change, because people are just they're gonna see $30 and $40 steaks at a restaurant and be like, the portion size dropped, the price is up. I talked to the manager at the restaurant, and he said, his costs are going up like crazy. The price of beef is actually going up a lot. That was a prediction of mine earlier in the year after talking with Ned Schmidt. But, I mean, it's just really crazy that, most people don't really understand. They try to blame it on the wrong people, and I think that's what the government wants, and I think that's why the inflation scheme has lasted as long as it has, is because people really don't understand what inflation really is and, all the stuff that's going on with the Fed and fiat money.
Yeah, and it's all planned, and that's why I was saying to stay away from schools as much as possible. First of all, in your 12 years of public indoctrination camps for the government, day camps for kids, they would never bring up how the actual money system works. And then even if you go and you pay for 4 years of economics in a college and you're going to spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, you still won't understand how it works. They won't actually teach you the truth about how it all works. And they all teach you all this Keynesian economics, which is crazy, which is based on the idea that the more money you spend, the more rich everyone is, which is completely insane. And he had ideas like burying, if there wasn't enough jobs, you would take bottles and put dollar bills in it and bury it in the ground and let people dig it up, so that would create jobs. This is a completely insane.
And war.
Yeah, and war.
He thought war was a stimulus too. He thought war was a stimulus. Well, maybe it was a stimulus for the one country, right? But as Frederick Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt teach us, right, that you have to look at the whole thing, the seen and the unseen. And the unseen people is, all the factories are getting bombed, all the families that are getting destroyed, right, outside of the area that's doing well in the war, that's winning the war. So let's transition now, since we talked about war for a second. Let's talk about your views on what's going on with the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine right now.
Well, I've never been to the Ukraine or Crimea, and so I don't like to talk too much about places I've never been. However, the things that sort of strike me that are not being talked about too much is that, well, first of all, the U.S. is really getting super upset about it, but I think they're powerless to do much about it. They actually said they were going to put sanctions on Russia, and the Russians all laughed and said, "Oh, we'll just destroy the dollar then," which they, could help to do, and the dollar will be destroyed either way, and especially if China gets involved. And we've seen record Treasury bill sales just right after that. So you don't really know who's selling them, but it was a massive amount of Treasury bills were sold. So that put a shot across the bow of the dollar right there. And the other thing that no one really seems to talk about is a lot of the U.S. and the U.S. media and some U.S. people who listen to the U.S. government and the media are all saying this is terrible, it's an act of aggression by Russia. And it might be, I don't know, but they were never upset when the U.S. attacked Iraq for no reason and Syria for no reason, and they want to attack, talking about Libya for no reason. They wanted to attack Syria for no reason, yeah, all over the place. But when Russia does something fairly small like this, where they actually had a treaty where they actually could have their troops on the ground in Crimea, and actually 90%, I believe, of the people there are actually of Russian heritage, and so it really wasn't like this big attack like Iraq or Libya. It was almost just, they just had a referendum, and of course the U.S., which usually talks about how great democracy is, they had a vote, and it turns out that 96% of the people there want to join Russia, and the U.S. is saying you can't have a vote like that.
Hypocritical,
yeah,
right?
It's totally hypocritical because the exact same attack happened in Iraq. So what the U.S. is saying is, you've got forces on the ground there, therefore this election is illegitimate. Well, no one was saying that about Iraq when the U.S. had massive forces on the ground and they instituted democracy, and that's turned out really well.
Put a puppet in, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, they put their own puppet in. It's just very interesting. You see the U.S. plays by its own rules. The U.S. Needs to defend the petrodollar because that's why we went into Iraq and why, the guy at Libya was deposed and we took their gold and, all these other things is to defend the petrodollar and keep the fractional reserve gold system going for as long as possible. And then, when Russia tries to make their own play, the U.S. is just the U.S. is not going to let them do the same type of thing. But now it looks like China's shifting towards, backing Russia and these other countries, the BRIC countries, the G20, just seems fed up with the way the U.S. has been playing, and I think that's why most of the G20 is, right, accumulating physical gold.
Yeah, and the whole gold angle is very interesting because, of course, Germany asked for their gold back from the U.S., and the U.S. said, we'll return, 20% of it in 7 years? So the gold's obviously not there. But a lot of the gold is going towards Russia and China right now. Russia and China funnily enough, because 20 years ago, if we said this, we'd sound crazy. But they're sort of more the leaders of the freer market at this moment in time compared to the U.S. and they're producing a lot of stuff, and there's not a lot of regulation over there, and there's not a lot of taxation. I think the taxes in Russia are less than 10%. And it's creating a lot of wealth, and a lot of the gold is going over there, and a lot of the bitcoins are going to China. And so it's just an amazing time to see this because, of course, 20, 30 years ago, talking about the Soviet Union or communist China, we'd sound crazy if we said that's going to be a better place to be than the U.S. in the future. But it definitely is right now. It's all changing, and the U.S. is just devolving and collapsing. And every way you look at it, you see bankruptcies every week now. And this is supposed to be the recovery. There's no recovery. This is complete. They said it was a Goldilocks recovery at first, and that's true because it was basically a fairy tale. And then they said there was green shoots, and that'd be good if Ben Bernanke was a gardener, but all he actually produces is greenbacks, and no, it's all falling apart. And I think people are going to be shocked at how quickly this all starts to fall apart in the next few years. We're going to see amazing things happen. I really warn people, if you're in the U.S. and you have assets in the U.S., to start moving them, internationalize them now, get them into hard assets, anything that Janet Yellen can't print. We're actually having a crisis conference in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico from April 30th to May 4th, talking about all these issues and helping people to internationalize their assets. And we call it the crisis conference for a reason. I really see this as being one of the final few years where you actually have an opportunity to get some of your assets outside of the U.S. They actually have cash-sniffing dogs at most international airports in the U.S., checking people on their way out to make sure they have no cash. This is, these sort of things should be waking people up to what's really going on.
Yeah, we live in very interesting times right now, and it just seems like the rules keep changing every day, and it's after more and more taxes, after more and more money, more rules and regulations. You did mention the investment angle here, so let me get that here as we wrap things up. Do you still think precious metals are in a bull market even after their correction? And do you think how much of a portfolio for asset allocation do you think people should have in Bitcoin? Are you still accumulating it, or do you think it's too speculative?
I've never considered Bitcoin an investment. It's definitely a speculation. And I don't think you need to put a lot of your assets into it if you do want to speculate, because Bitcoin's either going to go to $1 million of Bitcoin in today's dollars in the next 10 years, or it's going to go to zero. And so it's definitely high risk, high reward. But because it has such a high upside, you really don't need more than a few percent of your total assets in Bitcoin if you do want to speculate. And I do restate it is a speculation. No one knows what's going to happen with it. But I'm quite optimistic about it. I think it's going to do very well. Talking about the precious metals, I haven't really talked, and you know this, Jason, because we've known each other for a while. I haven't really been talking too much about either the precious metals or the gold and silver stocks for almost 2 years now, because it's been a very bad market, and I hadn't seen any hope for that changing in the last few years. But I've seen a massive amount of changes in the last 3 months. There's a huge amount of money coming into the market now, especially the stocks as well. We're talking billions and billions of dollars coming in from all over Asia, even in the U.S. I just heard about from a friend that a fund in the U.S. is going to put $800 million. What was it? It was some huge amount. Maybe it was $8 billion. It was a really large amount. I can't remember.
China's putting a couple billion, I think, in through Sprott. The Koreans are putting some money in through Sprott, a couple $100 million or so.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of money coming in through Sprott from Asia. At least $1 billion or $2 billion, and then there's some American money slowly starting to come back, but most of the people on Wall Street are still Keynesian, so they'll only chase it if the chart looks good.
Oh yeah, no.
They don't really believe in it.
No, they'll be way behind the curve. These guys that are getting in now are very savvy. People like Rick Rule and Eric Sprott. These guys know this market inside out, and you can actually see it in the price action of both the precious metals and the stocks. They're doing very well. The gold stocks, some are up 30 to 50% in the last few months, and that's coming off of a long time bottom. So I think we've really seen the bottom here. So I'm going to be getting extra aggressive on the precious metals and the precious metal stocks this year because I'm seeing a lot of positives. And of course, the backdrop couldn't be any better. We have central banks around the world printing money, governments collapsing, wars on the verge every week. This is the perfect storm for precious metals.
Yeah, I think the next 3 to 5 years are going to be very fun to be a holder of the right gold and silver stocks. I mean, not really bad penny stock gold and silver juniors where the CEOs are paying themselves a couple $100,000 and flying around first class and staying in 5-star hotels, and then they're not putting the money back into the ground, and they have no money in their company balance sheet, no working capital. Avoid those companies.
Well, that was one of the good things about this last few years is it actually weeded out a lot of those type of companies. There's still some around, but there's a lot less.
Yeah, I'm actually glad about that because those part of the companies, unfortunately, a lot of people, because those companies had done well for a long time and there was a lot of excess, those guys have been weeded out. And there was, unfortunately, too many people who had way too much money in those companies instead of, the quality, more efficiently run companies. So, in wrapping things up here, Jeff, let me just ask you one more question because we talked about this before we started recording. If we had a free market reward here, so let's say the Malaysian Airlines actually offered over $1 million to find the plane, do you think it would get found a lot faster than with all these governments looking for it?
Oh, absolutely. You brought that up, and I think that's I've never heard that before, and that's a great free market solution to the problem. And all these things are mostly caused by governments in the first case. It seems like they're getting down to sort of figuring out what might have happened, and it seems like it might have been the pilot was angry about some political thing in Malaysia. So once again, the government, made someone go a little crazy, and they flew off to the Indian Ocean, and I don't know where it is, but I think that plane definitely won the 2014 Hide-and-Seek Champion Award.
Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous plane. Everyone has technology on board. You'd think that in our modern society with a big plane like that, we would fairly easily, and the U.S. has supposedly all these spy satellites, right, where they can zoom in and find things. You'd think that they would have found the plane already. But I really think that if there was a free market solution, in a small little, some of these poorer countries, right, you offer $1 million to reward. You're going to have fishermen out there almost every day, right, and boats. You're going to have everyone out there searching, right? So the plane would get found, I think, in days. It would have probably been found already if you would have offered $1 million. If the airlines would have said, we're going to offer $1 million more because the lawsuit money is going to be so enormous if we don't find the bodies, or maybe the people are still alive. Maybe the plane did make it all the way to Pakistan or somewhere and it parked. I don't. It's possible. It's really possible. But anyway, though, Jeff, just want to thank you for your time on a podcast today. We talked about a lot of interesting topics. Tell our listeners more about your products and your Anarchast, because I've listened to a few episodes of your Anarchast, especially with our mutual friend Adam Kokash, and I think they should check out a few episodes of those just to see if they're not as familiar with anarcho-capitalism.
Sure. Most of the stuff we talked about today is kind of stuff we talk about all the time at the Dollar Vigilante, and that's just dollarvigilante.com. And like you were saying, Jason, I have a podcast called Anarchast, and it talks about anarcho-capitalism. And we just interview anarcho-capitalists, and we've interviewed now over 110 of them. So we've got quite the library of very interesting discussions. Check it out. All we talk about is peace, love, and anarchy. For people who don't understand what anarchy is, it's just the idea that you don't want to initiate force or violence against other people, and you don't want them to do it against you. So if you actually believe in things like Jesus' golden rule, then you're basically an anarchist. It's always misportrayed, of course, by the media and the government, but it's really catching on now, and things like libertarianism even too are catching on. And libertarianism, you could talk about the definition of that, but it's you can call anarchists libertarians, but there's different levels of libertarians out there. But the truest form, the most peaceful and the best form is anarchy, and that's what we talk about at anarchast.com.
And tell our listeners more then about the second passports you offer and about your Gold's Gulch in Chile, because we might have some listeners there who might want to go visit in Chile and check things out.
Sure, yeah. At the Dollar Vigilante, I talk a lot about internationalizing yourself, and I've done that myself. I've lived what's called a permanent traveler, prior taxpayer theory lifestyle now for over 10 years, and I've lived all over the world. I'm currently in Mexico, but I usually am all over the world, and I'm trying to help people to also live that kind of lifestyle, and one great way to do that is to get a second passport, because the U.S. passport is very difficult. You're under worldwide taxation for your entire life, and then after you die, they take most of the rest of it in a death tax. So it's really just constant theft. And if you want to get outside of that, you should get a second passport. You can just go to tdvpassports.com, and Then as well, I really recommend that people get a second place or even a first place and just actually move out of the Western world. I see nothing but disaster for the Western world coming. I actually just wrote an article today comparing Barack Obama's USA Today to the early years of Mao's China, and it's amazing the similarities, and it's going to turn out like Mao's China, not necessarily in that many deaths from famine, but it's going to be really bad. So you might as well get out there. There's a ton of opportunity. I really like South America and Latin America. And so here in Mexico, we have something called ACA Condos at acacondos.com. We just have condos where a lot of freedom-minded people are moving. And down in Chile, I was involved in the founding of Galtz Chile, and you can just find that on the internet as well at galtzchile.com.
Okay, well, thank you again for your time, Jeff, and hopefully we'll have you back on again soon.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Jason.